Chapter 17 of Quintus Oakes, a Detective Story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Davidson. Quintus Oakes, a Detective Story by Charles Ross Jackson. Checkmated. The Negro was led away. He was in better spirits now, and smiling as only a Negro can. That extraordinary genius, the mystic Oakes, had by a process of reasoning that Joe himself was able to follow, not only cleared him of suspicion, but made a hero of him. The innate vanity of the race was reacting on the boy, and coming to the rescue of his nervous system, recently so severely strained. When he had gone, Oakes turned to us, and interrupting our exclamations, remarked, "Now that we are all here together, it would be wise perhaps briefly to review what clues we have obtained and their probable significance." We all assented to this suggestion, and by tacit consent Quintus Oakes began. "First, we have found that the cartridge picked up in the cellar, and evidently dropped by the man in the robe, is of the same pattern as the old ones in the pouch upstairs. They all belong to the old revolver which was taken away from its place, and for which another was substituted since my first visit here. With regard to its caliber, the important point, that old revolver meets the requirements of our deductions about the weapon used to murder Mr. Mark. Therefore, we have a chain of evidence connecting my assailant in the cellar, the man in the robe, with the assassin. We know also that the revolver was fired not far from the 150-foot distance. The man was an excellent shot, for you must consider the old style of weapon. He must have been large, or at least strong in the wrist, for a good shot with such a weapon cannot be made by a weak person." I interrupted. "The murder of Smith was considered to be due to a pistol ball of large caliber. Could the same weapon have been used?" "It could," said Oakes. "That one has been in the family for years. The style of the cartridges is somewhat similar to our modern ones, but they are very old, as we know by their appearance. Further," he continued, "in my opinion, the woman story connected with the Smith murder is based on a man in a black robe. It may have been the same man who is at the bottom of these later mysteries, though we are to remember that when Mr. Mark was killed, Joe saw no robe. In the annals of crime we find very few women doing murder in that way. It is a man's method. We must look then for a strong-wristed man, a man who has also strong arms and a cross on the left one, finally a man with a knowledge of revolvers, and who has in his possession, or has had, a large old-fashioned weapon, and cartridges, and also a robe. And one thing more strikes me," added Oakes in a slow, deliberate voice. "He is a man with a mania, an insane man, always or at intervals." "Yes," said the doctor, "I had concluded so too, Oakes. The wearing of a robe, especially in a confined place like the wall space, the cutting out of a panel, and the peculiar method of attack seem nonsensical and without proper reason. And the absence of provocation for these assaults and for the murder of good men like Smith and Mark point strongly to an unbalanced mind." "Probably correct," Oakes replied, "and I should say that the insanity is present at intervals only." "Mr. Oakes," said Chief Hallen then, "don't you think it advisable to investigate that story of the bandana handkerchief as soon as possible? Affairs in town may become pressing at any time, and we may be needed there." "Yes, Chief, certainly. We should lose no time about it," said Oakes. Then he spoke to Martin, and the latter retired and presently returned with Joe. The detective asked the boy if he would go and point out the stone from which the murderer was leaping when the handkerchief fell into the water. "You know it is nearly full moon, and several of my men will go with you, and so will Mr. Martin." The negro assented reluctantly, though bravely, for he was not devoid of superstition. Oakes called in 4 of his men and said, "Go with Mr. Martin and Joe. Take lanterns, and find the handkerchief which is at the bottom of the stream, if the boy is telling the truth and the murderer has not recovered it. He did not notice it drop, did he, Joe?" "No, Master Oakes. He just flew along and never looked around. He did not know where it dropped." The negro was using good English, and standing erect with a very important expression. He was innocent and the central figure now. He realized that dignity was becoming. An educated boy of his race can show great self-control under such circumstances. Vanity, thou goddess of transformation! While the searching party was gone, we spent the time discussing Mike's peculiarities, most of all his horseback ride in the moonlight, a curious departure for a hired man. "The whole thing is unusual in the extreme, Stone. Since the night that you were escorted to the pond by Chief Hallen's men, and there warned of impending danger, and your unknown friend was chased by the man lying in wait for you, I have had a net around Mike and Maloney and Cook, but with negative results," said Oakes. "You see, Maloney and Cook go about their business in a quiet fashion, while Mike cannot be approached very well. The men report him as very shrewd and suspicious." "Did you find out where Mike went on his horseback trip?" "No, that is another curious thing. The Lorona man who brought him the horse says that he has done it for a few days and received good pay. The horse was always returned promptly, once or twice by a boy, the other times by Mike himself." "To have done that, Mike must have walked back from Lorona," said Hallen. "No, he may have ridden part way. We found a man this evening who saw him take a team on the Lorona highway and ride into Mona after dark." "Where is Mike now?" I inquired. "Since the episode of that horseback ride witnessed by Dr. Moore and yourself, he has disappeared." "Disappeared?" "Yes, eluded all our men and never returned the horse." "Skipped, got away!" we cried in amazement. "Yes, but he won't stay away long. He will come back." We did not quite understand Oakes' speech, but there was evidently something behind it. At this point, with his characteristic swiftness of movement, he lighted a cigar and began to smoke, offering the box to us all. That meant that, as far as he was concerned, talking on business had ceased for a time. He was now recreating. Elliott and I walked to a window and looked out upon the front walk and the road, conversing upon the manner in which Joe had been brought to Mona. He had resisted the idea at first, but through the efforts of Martin and Elliott and the promise of reward, he had finally consented to the journey. They had explained to him that his refusal would defeat the ends of justice, and that escape was impossible, and when he realized that he had been unconsciously talking to watchers and polishing their shoes in his innocence, he saw the folly of further remonstrance. Thus was the important evidence of the negro secured. The strain of events was telling on us all. Quintus Oakes showed his deep concern by a tendency to leave us and remain alone. As Elliott and I were talking, he looked at the rolling hills beyond the pond and exclaimed, "Look, can I be mistaken, Mr. Stone? Look in the direction of Mona, away off on the plateau. Is not that a horse?" I followed his pointing and discovered in the moonlight the figure of a horse advancing rapidly over the blue-green fields along the path that led to the bridge. Oakes advanced to the window and gazed intently, shading his eyes with his hands. On the crest of the hill that dipped to the pond the horse soon stood out clearly against the dark blue of the sky. We could see a figure which had lain low on his neck rise and sit straight in the saddle, then flash a light. From near the road on our side of the pond came an answering light. A man stood there and exchanged signals with the horseman. The rider was moving his arms rapidly, and with them the light. The other was answering in similar manner. Oakes remained quiet, and we all gathered at the window about him. "What is it?" I asked. He turned and said to me, "Here, write as I read." I took an envelope and pencil from my pocket and wrote as Oakes deciphered the signals. "A message from Mona!" he cried. "Quick!" Then he read the letters as they appeared. "Discovered. Skinner has extra out. Pronounces me false. Says Hallen has tricked the town. Beware of Skinner. Tell Hallen to look out. Am off for New York. Then came a long wave over the head, and the horseman dashed back toward Lorona. We detected another horseman at a little distance, who joined him. They rapidly disappeared together. "Excellent!" exclaimed Oakes. "He has done his duty well." We saw the man on this side run post haste for the Mansion. As he rushed up the steps Oakes met him. "All right, boy. I saw the signals myself." Then to us he said, "Quintus Oakes, the false is discovered. That was he. He came to warn us." "Then Skinner has caught on, confound him," said Dowd, and we all silently assented. Oakes paced the room slowly. "Boys, we have been unexpectedly checked. The enemy has a strong hand. There is trouble ahead." "Yes, there is that," retorted the vigorous Hallen. "I must get away to headquarters, gentlemen." "Correct," answered Oakes, "and we will go with you, Chief. If trouble is coming, we will be useless here." With one accord we prepared to depart for Mona immediately. The carriage was brought to the door, and saddle horses also. Then we waited anxiously for the return of Martin's party. We were not long delayed. A commotion in the hall was heard, and in stepped Joe and Martin, followed by the men. Oakes' assistant advanced and laid a red handkerchief, dotted with white spots, upon the table. It was wet and heavy, and knotted by its four corners so as to form a pouch. "We found it, sir, in about 2 feet of water, partly covered with sand. Its weight was gradually sinking it to the bottom." Joe laughed hysterically, and lapsed into negro dialect. "See, Mars Oakes! See, boss! I done told you the truth." Oakes seized the handkerchief, and we all looked inside. It contained a few loose cartridges. "They will match the one I found in the cellar, and those of the old revolver," said Oakes. "The man of the Mansion mysteries and assaults is the murderer of Mr. Mark." We were intensely excited as we stood there viewing the evidence that was so conclusive. Not one of us made a remark, but the deep breathing of some and the pale faces of others showed the interest that was felt by one and all. Oakes discovered on one end of the handkerchief the initial S, and we all studied its appearance closely. Then Oakes asked Hallen if such handkerchiefs were unusual in Mona. "No, not at all. There are hundreds of them sold here, especially to the laborers on the waterworks, the Italians and the Poles," answered the Chief. "It's a very peculiar S," said Oakes, as he folded the handkerchief and put it in his pocket, giving the cartridges to Martin. He said nothing more, but seemed serious and thoughtful as usual, and then we set out all together on a wild drive to the police headquarters. Despite the lateness of the hour, the crowds were increasing. The square, with the hotel on one side and headquarters on the other, was the center of a vicious body of men, pushing, struggling, and forcing its way along, and pausing now and again to surge around headquarters. We could all see that Hallen was to have his hands full. "I should like to see Skinner very much," remarked Oakes in a sarcastic vein. "I should like to see his arms," said Moore. "They might be more interesting." Oakes looked at the speaker with one of his undefinable expressions. We could not tell whether the shot had been a true one or not. End of chapter 17. Recording by Kevin Davidson, www.blogordie.com. Of Quintus Oakes, a detective story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Davidson. Quintus Oakes, a detective story, by Charles Ross Jackson. Misadventures. Toward morning the crowd thinned. The street grew more quiet, although the very air still throbbed with action, even as the heart strokes within us. Quickly as events had come, we were yet only in the midst of our experiences. The clock in the Chief's room was striking 3, and drowsiness was stealing over me, as over the outside world, when a knock came at the front door, and Hallen admitted a man, weary eyed and panting. I recognized him as one of the men who had been masquerading about the mansion as a carpenter. He was dressed in a heavy jersey without a coat, and was evidently suffering from fatigue. He walked over to Oakes and spoke to him in a low voice. The detective asked a question or two, and turning, looked at Dr. Moore, asleep in a chair, fagged out, then at me. I was wide awake, anticipating more trouble. "Stone," said he, "are you good for a ride with me on horseback? We have found something important." "Yes," I answered, "I am ready." Speaking a word to Hallen and Martin, Oakes drew me aside. "Leave your overcoat. Come, we are needed." We passed out into the night and down a side street, led by the man who had summoned us. In a few minutes we reached a stable and found horses, and I knew that it had been so arranged. We were mounted and off without notice from any but a hostler and the proprietor, who had told me that my horse was strong and capable. We pounded to the east along the highway toward Lorona for a mile or so, then swerved into a narrow road winding across the plateau to the south and west. I knew we were making for the river road below the mansion. I had heard of this lane, which swept in a long curve around the southern end of Mona, connecting the highway with River Road about 2 miles south of the mansion gate. As we galloped along, Oakes communicated to me the cause of our trip. "Two of my men have located a hut deep in the forest at the south end of the mansion grounds. There is something going on there. They think they have the murderer. One of the men came for me, the other is watching." I felt the blood surge to my brain, and the hardships of the night were forgotten in the intensity of my anticipations. At last, and I was to be at the finish! Instinctively I felt for my revolver. It was safe, and the assurance that it was with me gave relief. Fortunately I was a fair horseman, and my mount was one of those animals that respond to the rider's every command. My two companions were also well mounted, and the long ride was soon over. Arriving at River Road, we dismounted and left the horses in charge of the man who had accompanied us. Another man now came from the darkness, another of Oakes' retinue. He was to lead us to the hut. Then we three entered the fringe of the woods, and cautiously followed our guide deep into the denser section. The moon was hidden occasionally by fleeting clouds, and as we advanced farther and farther its rays ceased to reach us. All was gloom, deep and almost impenetrable. Our guide whispered, "He is in the hut, sir, waiting for someone. Follow me." Then he advanced a few paces and led us through a more open section of the forest. Soon he stopped. "Stay here until you see a light flash ahead. That is his signal. He has been here an hour, but his friend is slow in coming." "Perhaps he knows it is too dangerous," said Oakes. Our guide went from us to a short distance to keep separate watch. The giant trees around were more scattered than elsewhere in the forest through which we had passed. Occasionally the sheen of the moonlight was visible far above us as the branches swayed in the breeze. Here below the air was quiet and the gloom deep. Our eyes, accustomed to it now, could detect the silent army of tree trunks around us for a considerable distance. The air was chilly, but excitement kept us from feeling the need of our greatcoats. Beneath our feet the ground was soft but dry, and the leaves were scattered about in profusion, for this was the fall of the year and the woods had begun to strip at the touch of the frost king. Quintus Oakes stood by my side behind a tree. We were both gazing intently in the direction that had been indicated to us. Nothing was visible for a few moments, when suddenly Oakes pressed my shoulder with his hand and said in a low, quiet voice, "See, off there, that flash." I had noticed nothing, but as I drew breath to answer I beheld the diverging rays of a light, probably a lantern, play up and down a tree trunk at least 100 feet away. It moved quickly and then jumped to another trunk. In its transit it threw a long, narrow yellow streak on the ground between. Then it would be lost suddenly to view. I thought the trees intervened in our line of vision at such times, but Oakes explained, "He is waiting and signaling with a dark lantern. See how the light is shut off at will. He is surely within a hut of some kind. I can see the outlines occasionally." "What can he be up to?" I whispered. "He is at least a mile from the Mansion, and nearly as much from the road." "That light is a guide," said Oakes. "His confederate cannot find the hut without it. The forest is too dense." We waited in silence, stealing very carefully nearer to the hut, and our patience was finally rewarded. We saw the door, which was sideways to us, open with a quick movement and a man enter. Then all was dark within and without, save in one little spot where, through the back wall of the hut, a few rays found exit in long narrow streaks of yellow light, scarcely visible to us. "He has turned his bull's eye away from the window and the door, and has not shut it. They are using the light for some purpose," said the detective, touching my arm and motioning me to follow him. With utmost caution we advanced until we were near enough to hear voices. At first they came to us as low, indistinct muttering, but as we neared the hut we determined that they were raised in argument. At our distance, however, we were unable to recognize either. "Keep away from the front," said Oakes, "lest the door be opened and we be discovered." We stationed ourselves in the shadow near the window, which was low in the side of this curious log cabin, for such we saw it to be. It was boarded inside, evidently, for the light was kept from without too well. Through the window we beheld two dim forms bending over a board table. One was handling something like paper, in the diverging streak of illumination from the bull's eye opening of the lantern, which was on the table, facing the back wall of the hut, just as Oakes had said. The figure could not be distinguished either as to face or form, for the light was very indistinct save in the immediate path of the rays. As we moved ever so little from our chosen positions, our vision of the table and the streak of light upon it was cut off, owing to the small size of the window. I knew by the movement of Oakes' arm that he had secured his weapon, and I closed my hand about mine, holding it, muzzle down, by my side, ready for instant use. The voices within became louder, and I distinguished the words, "You must, man, you must get away." It was answered by a half mumbled protest, and then we saw one figure arise and stoop over the light on the table. "Here, take this and go." Oakes touched me. "The murderer preparing to get away," he said. We could see a pair of hands counting what appeared to be money. Then they extended their contents to the other hands that awaited them. The figure who had given the money arose, and with his back to us made as if to leave. Suddenly, without an instant's warning, we saw the form of the other come partially into view, and an arm steal slowly upward. As the first figure moved away, it closed about his neck, and a death struggle began, revealed to us by the blurred swaying of the two, and a deep despairing gasp from the man being strangled. "Murder!" said Oakes, and we moved toward the door of the hut, with one thought in mind, the helping of a fellow meeting his death at the hands of what we believed to be the assassin of Mona. I was excited. It was unquestionably the most trying moment of my life, and I met it as we had not foreseen. Advancing 2 steps hurriedly, my feet caught in one another somehow, and with a wild war whoop of distress I fell forward on my face, carrying Oakes with me, crashing headlong, mix up that must have been heard for 100 yards in that still morning air. It was all over. The two in the hut heard us. The strangler released his hold, and the light was extinguished instantly. Out of the door the figures flew like demons. They were both anxious to escape detection, that was evident. They must have thought that it was a charge of the Light Brigade. Oakes and I were up and after them. He shouted a word of command, then I heard more footsteps, and our guide answered. Instantly came the sounds of a struggle, fierce but short, in the darkness beyond. We could see nothing, but we heard a heavy fall, and then the rush of an escaping man or men. Oakes and I were quick to reach the spot, and managed to find our forest guide groaning on the ground. At Oakes' suggestion we carried him back to the hut, which I ascertained was now quite empty. It was a gruesome experience this. Oakes refused to allow a match to be struck, saying, "Don't draw their fire, Stone. We must be in a nest of them." My chagrin was deep as I thought of the opportunity that my clumsiness had brought to naught. We soon succeeded in reviving our man. He had been felled by a fist blow on the face, evidently. "Did you see the other fellow?" asked my companion. "Yes, sir, I saw one. He was Skinner. I caught his face in the lantern light just as they doused it." "Indeed!" cried Oakes. "Skinner! You mean the man who runs the newspaper, the one I have ordered shadowed?" "Yes, sir, the same. It was he who was counting the money." "Yes, that agrees. Go on. Who was the other?" "I did not see him at all, Mr. Oakes, but I ran into him, or rather he into me. I have a piece of his shirt here." The man handed something to Oakes, and together we peered at it in the dim morning light. We soon determined that it was a good sized piece of the neck of a shirt. Then, watching carefully the woods around, I stood on guard, while Oakes examined the inside of the hut. It was an old hunter's cabin evidently, and had not been recently used. The table was made of rough boards, and was supported by two stumps. It might have served as a place to lie upon also. Oakes uttered an exclamation as the guide handed him a piece of paper money that was found on the floor. Nothing else was found. The lantern had gone with the men. One man was giving money to the other to get him away, and nearly lost his life in defense of the rest in his possession. "This is a piece of a bill torn off in the struggle," said Oakes. "Do you recognize this shirt pattern?" asked he. "Yes, sir," said our guide. "It's like what O'Brien wears." "Exactly," said Oakes. "And you," he addressed the man, "come with us to the road. Can you walk that far?" "Yes, indeed. I'm all right now, but I was finished for a few minutes." "You were knocked out well," remarked Oakes. "Lucky you were not killed." We returned to River Road by the way we had come, arriving there as dawn was breaking and the sun beginning to throw his rays across the plateau before us. We found our horses and the man who had escorted us from Mona. Oakes spoke to him. "Here, Bob, let Paul ride on your horse. He has had a smash. You walk. Both of you go to the mansion and tell the others to find O'Brien if possible. Paul will explain. Make no arrests, but don't let your man get away." We vaulted into our saddles and galloped ahead. As we were returning to headquarters by way of the Corners, I felt like a culprit. I was devoured by chagrin, and thoroughly ashamed of my awkwardness. Oakes' face was grave, much more so than usual, but he rode his horse with alertness and confidence, and I wondered at the endurance he displayed, also at his consideration, for in this hour, when keen disappointment must have been his, he did not mention my mishap, which had so changed events. He acted as though it were beneath him to notice it, and that made me feel all the more mortified, but at the same time I vowed to redeem myself in his eyes. Dashing toward the mansion gate, we both pulled up our horses as Oakes uttered a sudden exclamation. He rested one hand on the pommel of his saddle and pointed with the other at the man inside the mansion gate. His back was toward us, and he had been raking the wall apparently. "Look! Notice!" and the voice of my companion grew sharp and significant. "Look!" The man was now reaching upward with one hand, the rake held within its grasp, and with a graceful, well calculated swing, he was deftly denuding a branch overhead of its dying leaves. "Well, I see," I answered. "It's Maloney cleaning up." "Exactly," came the staccato answer. "But how about the strength of the wrist that can handle such a heavy rake with such certainty?" "Oh, yes, he's strong," I cried. "He's got plenty of muscle, apparently." "He has a strong wrist and a strong arm, and not such an awfully large chest," answered Oakes calmly, as though speaking of the weather or of something of no importance. Fool that I was, it was only then that his meaning suddenly went home to my slow acting brain. I saw a light in Oakes' eyes that I had never before seen, cool, steely, calculating. "No," I whispered, "impossible. But you are searching for just such a person." "Yes, of course," was the laconic answer. "But let's talk with the gentleman of the rake." Oakes led the way to within a few feet of the gate, then, rising in his stirrups, shouted to Maloney. The latter turned, and with a look of recognition came forward quickly towards us. "Good morning, sir. Good morning, Mr. Clark. I was going to headquarters for you soon. They told me you had gone there with Chief Hallen." "Yes. Why did you wish to go there, Maloney?" "Because, sir, there is something wrong, something about the mystery here. You know, sir, you left word to report if anything unusual happened." Maloney spoke quietly and without embarrassment. We had noticed before that he was fairly well educated, another victim of unfortunate circumstances. "What has occurred?" There was a hard ring in Oakes' voice. It told me to be discreet. I had heard that accent before. "Mr. Clark, I went down to Lorona last night to see my brother, who was sick. When I returned it was late. I was on horseback, and I noticed a man on the road lighting a lantern. I spoke to him. He would not answer, but started into the timber at the far south end of the grounds." "Well, what was peculiar?" "It was Skinner, sir." "Skinner?" "Yes, sir. I saw his face by the light. I thought it was strange, tied my horse, and followed him. He went a long way into the woods to a hut, and waited a couple of hours with the light. Then another man came, and they had a quarrel. There was a terrible noise, and then the light went out, and they disappeared. I went back to get my horse, and have just got here." "Who's with Skinner?" "I don't know, sir. I was facing the door of the hut, but it was too dark to see. They worked with a dark lantern." We had quietly walked our horses up to the gate while listening to Maloney. Oakes' eyes were on the ground. Suddenly he looked up. "Thank you very much, Maloney. You have done well in reporting to me. I will see Chief Hallen. This is a matter perhaps for the police, certainly not for me to work on." Wheeling our horses, we darted to the Corners and on toward Mona. Quintus Oakes was very quiet. He seemed annoyed or nonplussed, and the pace that he set was terrific. As we neared the town we slowed up, and I asked excitedly of the taciturn man by my side, "Tell me what's up." He turned slightly in his saddle. Maloney was there. He acknowledged it. So far he told the truth, but he lied about returning on horseback. There were no hoof marks going toward the stable. None entered the mansion gate, and he lied also about his brother in Lorona, for there is no such relative of his there. Maloney has no brothers or sisters hereabouts. I now remembered Oakes' careful scrutiny of the ground while we were talking with Maloney, and I also realized how close was the net he had spread about everyone at the mansion. "If Maloney was at the hut, how did he get back ahead of us?" I asked. "Ran, of course. Took the inside way through the woods. He knows the paths well. He may not only have been near the hut, Stone, he may have been in it. If so, he tried to kill Skinner, for the old man had money." Then Oakes continued, "Perhaps it was Maloney who was about to get away if he could, but he can't." The detective added with a sardonic smile as he closed his jaws firmly. "But," I exclaimed, "suppose it was Maloney? What of O'Brien? He was there. We have his shirt, in part at least." "Oh, bother O'Brien. He makes me tired," cried Oakes enigmatically. "He will get himself into trouble some day." "Yes, yes," I contended, "but he, too, has strong arms and a strong wrist, and could have used the revolver." "Surely. So could many men. These clues are merely the primary ones. Many men answer their requirements. They are worth very little by themselves. They simply point to a certain type of man. They are simply links as yet unforged into the chain." "But one more thing, Oakes," I cried. "Why should Maloney volunteer the information that he was at the place, if he had no good excuse for being there?" "That's it exactly. Perhaps he mistrusts he was seen, and wants to get in his story first. Perhaps he cannot hold his tongue. Perhaps his mind is weak. We are looking for a mind somewhat unusual, Stone. Remember that." We were now at the square in front of the little hotel, and dismounting we proceeded to enter the door of the inn. As we did, I took my companion by the arm and drew him aside. "Say, Oakes," I said, "don't tell Dr. Moore how I involved matters by that stumble. I would never hear the end of it." Oakes looked surprised, then his eyes beamed in merriment. He smiled ever so slightly. "That certainly was a beautiful charge you made over me. said he. He did not promise not to tell, however, but months afterwards Dr. Moore learned all about it from me, and I then found that Quintus had remained silent. Chapter 18. Recording by Kevin Davidson, www.blogordie.com.
Of Quintus Oakes, a detective story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Quintus Oakes, a detective story. By Charles Ross Jackson. Chapter 19. A faulty story. After breakfast, while Oakes gave the doctor a brief resume of our night's adventure, the two rival newspapers came out with extras on the recent doings. Skinner's comments were sarcastic and bitter, and, while not actually inciting to lawlessness, played upon the roused feelings of the townspeople by scathing allusions to Hallen's inefficiency and by reiterating the story of the false Quintus Oakes. Our friend Dowd, on the other hand, came forward with a moderate, well-worded article that swayed the minds of the more thoughtful. The reading of his words won us more friends. Who does not like to hear two sides of an argument, or to read cool words of wisdom from one whose career entitles him to respect? We had learned at breakfast that Hallen had taken hold with a grip of iron during the night. Many arrests had followed his activity, and the quietude of the forenoon was largely due to his efforts of the night before. As we stood outside the hotel remarking upon the changed appearance of the streets, our attention was attracted to a small crowd approaching the square from the direction of the Corners. There were men running ahead and shouting, then a close, compact body swaying around a central attraction. We thought we detected a man being helped along as though he was severely injured, and we clearly distinguished the words "shot at," "the murderer," and many expressions of anger and terror. Oakes looked into the mass of men and scanned the pale face of the injured one. "It's Maloney," he said, seizing the doctor and myself by the arm. He pushed his way forward as the crowd recognized and opened for Mr. Clark. "Well, Maloney, what is it?" asked Oakes. "I was shot at, sir," he exclaimed. "Shot at, in the very spot where Mr. Mark was killed. And then, sir, someone hit me a blow on the head, and I fell." I saw Oakes run his hand over Maloney's scalp. "I was dazed, sir, when these men found me," finished the gardener. "Yes," said two laborers. "We found him on the ground just waking up, and acting queer like. And here's the revolver. It was lying behind the rock, sir." "How did it happen?" asked Oakes. "I heard a shot near me," Maloney answered. "A heavy revolver shot. I turned, and was then hit with something like a sandbag, I guess, for everything got dim." Hallen walked him into the headquarters building to avoid the rapidly increasing crowd. "Shut the doors," he ordered. The command was quickly obeyed, and we who had worked together were all within the building now, away from the crowd. "Who was it?" asked Hallen of Maloney. The man hesitated a while, but upon being pressed for an answer, finally replied, "I have not dared to mention my suspicions, sir, but the fellow looked like Mike O'Brien. At any rate, he was wounded. He was walking with a limp, sir, and I saw blood on his trousers leg. He must have been in a scrap or an accident. When I was coming to," he continued, "I saw him hiding a revolver behind a rock. I pointed out the place to the men when they came a few minutes after, and they found it." "Why did you not cry out for help?" asked Oakes suddenly, even viciously, I thought. Maloney answered quickly, "Because he thought I was dead, and I let him think so. If I had made any noise, sir, he would have finished me. I did not move until I knew help was near." "Good," said Oakes. "You have presence of mind. Let us see the revolver. The men left it here, did they not?" Hallen stepped forward with the weapon. Oakes examined it, but his look informed us that it was not the old one taken from the wall in the mansion. Further questioning failed to reveal anything of importance, but it seemed clear from what Maloney said that the assaulter escaped on horseback after he was seen by his intended victim, for Maloney insisted that he had heard a galloping horse afterwards. "He was wounded, you said?" queried the detective. "Yes, sir, quite badly, I thought." Moore examined Maloney's injury, and took careful note of his condition. Then the gardener was told to go, and he was soon joined outside by the two laborers, his new found friends. Together they went to the hotel bar across the street. As they disappeared, Oakes exchanged glances with the doctor, and I knew that something was wrong. There came a long silence, which Hallen finally broke. "This is a queer story, Oakes. I don't understand it. Is it the murderer at work again, and O'Brien accused? You say the Mansion mysteries are the work of the same hand that shot Mr. Mark, and possibly Mr. Smith. But those mysteries are old, and O'Brien is a recent arrival here, and knows very little of the Mansion. I cannot see his guilt. How do you explain it, Oakes?" The keen man addressed faced the Chief, and we all knew the words that were coming were valuable. "Chief, I have just told you of Mr. Stone's adventures with me this morning, of my proof that Maloney lied to us. Well, he has lied again." "Yes," chimed in Dr. Moore, "the man's a fake. He was not seriously injured, if at all." "I saw through Maloney's story instantly," continued Oakes. "He said he was assaulted by O'Brien, who was, according to his own story, a badly wounded man. He said O'Brien hid the revolver afterwards, while he, Maloney, was shamming death, and that O'Brien sought to escape." "It is nonsense." "Why? I fail to see," I asked excitedly. Oakes turned to me. "Why, Stone, don't you see the flaws? Would a seriously injured man attempt deliberate murder? What show would he have to escape? Then again, if able to get away himself, would he hide the revolver near the scene of the crime, behind a rock? No, he would take it with him as a defensive weapon, or else hide it where it never could be found, in the Hudson, for instance, or the brook, both near at hand." "True enough," cried Hallen, his face showing his admiration. "But what's your idea, then, Oakes?" "Just this, gentlemen. Maloney himself shot O'Brien, and seeing the latter escape, knew that his game was up, for he had been identified by O'Brien. So he hid the revolver that he himself used, and then pretended to have been sandbagged and shot at. He relied on the weight of his word against O'Brien's, not knowing anything of the evidence collected against him, or that we were anything but agents and workmen about the Mansion." The Chief looked long and half skeptically at Oakes, then asked, "Does Maloney meet your requirements? Does he fit the bill?" "Well, he has a strong wrist and long arms," answered Oakes. "That places him among the possibles. He also has a comparatively narrow chest, such as the man who had wore the robe. You remember we reasoned that out. Those three things cover much ground. Then again, he is an old resident, knows all about the Mansion, was here when Smith was murdered." Elliot now spoke up. "Oakes, you said the murderer was a good shot. Is Maloney a good shot with a revolver?" "Yes, he was. He used to belong to the National Guard years ago. He was a splendid shot then, according to evidence procured by my men." "But the revolver to day was not the old one?" queried the Chief. "No," answered Oakes, "but he can easily have two." "I had better arrest him now as a suspicious person," exclaimed Hallen excitedly. "Not yet. Let us be sure first. Remember, Skinner has a motive for crossing us. He has tried to defeat the aims of justice right through. He was dealing money this morning to someone. Suppose it was to Maloney. What is his reason?" Hallen thumped the table furiously, as though a new thought had come to him. "Skinner answers the physical requirements also, Mr. Oakes. He was also a guardsman, a good shot." "Yes," answered Oakes, "but scarcely strong enough to overpower me at the Mansion." "Unless he was acting while in mania, as we presume this criminal acts," said Moore. I sat spellbound as these men discussed the intricacies of the affair, realizing the truth of their reasonings, and marveling at the clues, conceptions, and brilliant memories revealed, especially by the masterly Oakes. "Too bad you cannot find Skinner and see what he is up to," I remarked. "We must let Hallen keep watch on him until we are ready for our final move. It would be easy to arrest him on suspicion, but that might defeat our object. And again, I do not believe in making arrests until my case is clear," said Oakes. "Do you not think Skinner might be the murderer?" I asked. "Not as I see things now. It seems more probable that he is interested in someone whom he wants to get out of harm's way. His motive throughout this affair has been to hide the guilty, I think." "And what do you make of that man O'Brien?" queried Dowd. "He seems to be a mysterious fellow." Oakes and Hallen exchanged knowing glances. "He's another possibility. He's a little Tartar," said the detective. "But won't Maloney get away now?" asked Elliott. "Nit," was the answer from Hallen. "Those two laborers with him are my specials." I was getting entirely tied up now, but, desiring to appear erudite and worthy of such company, I blurted forth: "Who is Mike O'Brien, anyway?" Oakes looked at us all coolly and exasperatingly. "He seems to be a little extra thrown in. I'll tell you all about it when you tell me if the S on the handkerchief has anything to do with Mr. Skinner." An exclamation of surprise went up. We had all forgotten that. But before we could resume, a message arrived for Oakes. It was brought by one of the men whom we knew so well by sight around the mansion. He told of the finding of a burned tree, hidden in the forest near the scene of the murder of Mr. Mark. Those who were searching had discovered that the tree was recently struck by lightning, and that within its burned interior was ash. The man had brought some with him, and also a small crumpled piece of newspaper. Oakes looked carefully at them as we glanced over his shoulder. "At last!" cried he. "Here is wood ash, wet as was that on the robe, and here is paper like that of the Daily News which we found in the robe, is it not?" "Yes," cried Moore, "it is indeed. Can it be?" "Yes," came the answer from Oakes. "My orders to search for the origin of the ash have been crowned with success. The robe was in that tree." "But," I cried, "of what value is that?" "Just this: the robe was not worn at the time of the murder. Remember, Joe did not see it. It had been hidden, probably. The murderer used it to go and come in, but for some unknown reason discarded it at the shooting." "Excuse me," said the messenger. "Excuse me, Mr. Oakes, but that's about right. The tree was beyond the stone where he crossed and lost the handkerchief. He was running for the robe, sir, and the murderer was after his disguise." Oakes looked at his subordinate calmly, and smiled ever so slightly. The man bowed and retreated, abashed at his own impetuosity. Hallen turned to our friend Oakes and said: "I never in my life saw anything like this like you." Oakes, always ready to sidestep praise in any form, answered with one of his chilling glances: "Oh, bother! You're young yet, Hallen. You need age." Hallen half resentfully yanked his cap on his head and strode to the door. "Well," he remarked, "here's where I take a look at Maloney's arms. I am dead tired of theorizing." "Stop!" commanded Oakes. "You'll spoil it all." "I won't spoil the cross on the arm, the cross of indigo, if it's there. And if it ain't there, it ain't. Hang it all, anyway." And forthwith Hallen strode out the door, down the steps towards the hotel barroom, with Oakes and the rest of us following in a vain endeavor to head him off. When we reached the barroom, Hallen was already in the side room. We rushed toward the little room door, expecting to see Maloney in the grasp of Hallen, but instead we beheld the Chief gazing in stupefaction at his two men dead drunk, heads between their hands on the little round table. "Ha!" cried the Chief in a voice that shook the glasses on the shelves in the barroom and brought the white-coated attendant with one bound to the door. "And Maloney's escaped." "Escaped!" cried the barkeeper. "Escaped! Nit, why, he paid for the drinks and walked out half an hour ago. Said he had a job at the mansion. These fellows, gosh!" cried the man as he shook them. "Drunk! What's up? What does it mean, Chief?" Then Quintus Oakes spoke in tones of dulcet and ineffable sweetness, cooing charmingly. "It means that Chief Hallen pays for a round of the best you've got. In order to see a cross on a man's arm, it becomes necessary first to catch the man, something like the bird's tail and the salt proposition." "Mix 'em up, quick!" shouted Hallen, advancing to the bar. "Hell and be damned! Get the two samples of Mona's police out into the air. Hallen!" End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Quintus Oakes, a detective story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gertrude Durrett. Quintus Oakes, a detective story by Charles Ross Jackson. Chapter 20. Chapter 20. A Man's Confession. The assault upon Maloney was now the talk of the town. Hallen, who had enjoyed a respite from censure, was again furiously blamed for inability and incompetence. None but our select few discerned that Maloney was lying, for none knew as much of the intricacies of the case as did we. All were crying out for the instant arrest of the one who had attempted to kill him, but none but the few who had heard Maloney's statement within headquarters knew that it was O'Brien he had accused, and only those few knew that his story was probably false. Although the order had gone forth quietly, as we knew, to find Mike O'Brien, still it was not known to save Hallen's and Oakes' men. The masses were in ignorance of the strides we had made toward the solution of the horrible happenings at Mona, and of course Hallen was getting more than he deserved in the way of criticism. Oakes told us that he momentarily expected some new developments in the case, as Hallen was endeavoring to find Skinner and bring him to the mansion. His surmises proved true, for it was found an easy matter to locate the old man, and early in the evening Hallen arrived at the mansion and joined us in the apartments upstairs, and with him were Martin and Skinner. Dowd, the rival of the old man, was with us, having begged earnestly of Oakes to be allowed to follow as close to the action as possible, and having stuck by us like a veritable leech since the morning. Dowd was a nice fellow, and a newspaper man from start to finish, and he seemed to have developed a great liking for Oakes. We were all upstairs when Martin ushered in the tall, rather slender, but powerful old man, Skinner. None of us save Hallen had seen him at close range before, but I saw a curious expression, half of defiance, half of dismay, in his face that made me watch him most closely. Dr. Moore was scanning his features carefully, in a way that showed he had detected something, but Quintus Oakes, rising from his seat and advancing politely to meet the old gentleman, seemed neither to have seen anything nor to know anything. He was just the polished gentleman we all knew so well, but I noticed that, as he shook hands with Mr. Skinner, he cast a quick glance at the man's arm and the wrist, and then at the old man's eyes. Moore whispered, "He has excluded Skinner as the criminal. Look! See him take it all in." Oakes was leading Skinner to a seat, and as he walked he spoke freely. He had discovered that which Dr. Moore had also seen, but which I had failed to detect. "Mr. Skinner, allow me," he said gracefully. "It's not well lighted here, and I imagine that little white scar on your right eye, on your cornea, just in front of the pupil, interferes somewhat with your vision." "Yes, Mr. Clark, it does interfere just a trifle." "Just enough to spoil duck shooting, eh? I understand you used to be quite fond of that sort of thing, Mr. Skinner." Moore and Hallen exchanged glances, and the knowledge was general to us. The old man was not the murderer, for the assassin could shoot well, and the old scar on the eye prevented that in Skinner's case. But to what do I owe the honor of a request to call at the mansion, escorted by such a nice young man, to see Mr. Clark, the agent?" queried Skinner. The old fellow was shrewd. He looked at Hallen and smiled half-heartedly. Then he looked at me and remarked that we had met before somewhere, and extending his hand to Moore, he said he guessed he was glad to know us all better. Then turning quietly to Chief Hallen, he laughed and gave us a shock from which we were unable to rally for a few moments. "Well, Chief, they're keeping you busy. They tell me you don't like it because I exposed that fellow who palmed himself off as Mr. Quintus Oakes. That man Rogers, you know." "No, I did not like it particularly. It interfered with my plans. I am trying to catch the murderer of Mr. Mark, you know." "Suppose you are. You haven't got him yet. You can search me, Chief. I think Mr. Quintus Oakes here is entitled to all the credit so far, eh? Don't you?" The old fellow turned to Oakes as he spoke the words that showed he was not to be fooled into believing Oakes was Clark. We moved nearer. Skinner knew all, apparently. Then Oakes arose to meet the occasion and stood before the old man. "Mr. Skinner, I thank you for warning me not to come to Mona. It was your letter I received. But why did you warn me? Was it to protect your secret?" Oakes had acted all along as though he had learned some things he had not spoken of to us. He and Hallen had seemed to comprehend more than we others knew, but I was scarce prepared for such a sudden revelation. "Stop!" cried the old man. "Stop! You have no right. I did warn you to keep away from Mona. I knew of the Mansion mysteries. I knew you by sight in New York. I recognized you here on your first visit. I did not want to see a good man get in trouble." "Thank you," said Oakes. "Thank you. Your kindness was appreciated, but you have another motive. You are shielding someone." "None, no one," came the answer. "Nonsense!" And Oakes' eyes blazed as he spoke. "You tried to send him away this morning. You gave him money at the hut. You were nearly killed by the man you are protecting. Can you explain it?" The old man was shaking violently. He arose, tottered, and sat down. Then, burying his head in his hands, he remained silent for a space of seconds. Then, shaking his head, he moaned, "No, I can't explain. I had given him all. Mr. Oakes, he was not robbing me. He seemed angry. I could not understand." "I can," said Oakes. "The man you have befriended these many years, the man Maloney who used to work with you in your shop, to whom you gave, among many other things, a red bandana handkerchief with your initial S upon it, one of those handkerchiefs you use about the printing office. That man, we think, is a maniac. We surmise that he has the killing mania. Did you not suspect it?" The old man's manner changed to one of terrified inquiry. "Why, I never suspected. I thought he was peculiar. I mistrusted he was at the bottom of the Mansion mysteries. I wanted to send him away to give him a show." Oakes hesitated, then answered evasively but forcefully, "Maloney is probably irresponsible. He is the man of the Mansion, the woman, so-called, of the Smith murder, the murderer of Mr. Mark, we believe, but we are without proof as yet." The old man's face filled with the blood dammed back from the throbbing heart, then paled as the heart-strokes weakened, and the cold sweat of collapse appeared in beady drops upon his brow. Moore was at his side with a drink, and we all placed him on the sofa and watched the color return to the yellow-white face, and the respirations deepen again. Oakes bent solicitously above him. "There is something back of all this, Skinner. Maloney is more than a friend." Then, as the old man arose, the detective, in tones gentle but strong, called Skinner's attention to the fact that his conduct in using the influence of his journal against Hallen and the discovery of the criminal needed an explanation. Skinner arose, steadied himself, and returning to Hallen, said, in a voice scarcely audible, "Chief, I have always been a good citizen till now. I wanted Maloney to get away. He would not go. I thought he might be at the bottom of the Mansion mysteries, but I had no idea he could be a murderer. I did not wish his identity revealed. I tried to discourage Mr. Oakes. I tried to save my reputation, Chief, to save a name good as the world goes. But this is my punishment. Study my face, Chief. Study my eyes, my chin. Then imagine a handsome Spanish face, dark-haired, dark-skinned. Do you see why Maloney has blue eyes and a square chin, with hair black as the Indians, and skin swarthy as night? Gentlemen, do you understand? She is dead. Maloney does not know. I cared for the lad. He is my son. He has always been eccentric, but although perhaps insane, I had no proof. I tried to hide my secret, but if justice demands his capture, Chief, I am at your disposal." The old man extended his hands, his lips quivering with the words that spelled ruin, and advanced to the Chief as though expecting arrest, while we all remained motionless in pitying silence. Hallen glanced at him. Then the burly fellow turned suddenly to Martin. "Here, you son of a dandy," said he, and we all smiled, and Oakes bit his lip in suppressed emotion. "Here, you go on down to the stable and tell my coachman to drive round to the front door. I am going to have him drive home with Mr. Skinner." Then they walked to the door, the old man half leaning on the thick-set, muscular shoulders of Hallen. At the threshold the Chief turned quickly. "If any of you ducks say anything, you're a lot of dudes," and the two disappeared downstairs to the coach. After Hallen had returned to the room, and as the rumble of the wheels died away in the distance, Dowd addressed a question to Oakes. He wanted to know how Oakes had secured advance information as to the history of Skinner and the handkerchief. "Well, Dowd, as soon as Skinner began antagonizing our moves, I suspected that he was the writer of the letter of warning. Then I ordered his history. You know those things are easily obtained. He came here years ago, it seems, comparatively unknown, and worked his way up, employing a young fellow for many years in his office. This young fellow went West, but returned later. He was Maloney. He had not the mental attainments for his employer's business, but the older man kept in touch with the younger, even after he found it necessary to dispense with his services. When I saw Skinner, I detected some resemblance between them. This seems to have escaped general notice, but Dr. Moore was not deceived. A study of the eyes and the ears and the nose confirmed my suspicions of the paternity of Maloney. But all that, while interesting, was not so valuable as the knowledge that Maloney had several handkerchiefs given him by Skinner. You see, Skinner's conduct was so suspicious throughout that we have investigated him thoroughly. We found he wore such handkerchiefs around his neck in the printing office. We found Mrs. Cook was aware that Maloney had some of them. He told her that Mr. Skinner gave them to him. He always was proud of Skinner's friendship. "Then you knew all about it this morning, Quintus?" I cried, exasperated at the man's taciturnity. "You knew when you said you would tell who O'Brien was, if I would tell whether the S had anything to do with Skinner." No, but I mistrusted. The proofs were only more recently secured. Then, as you now have the answer regarding the S, it seems only fair that you tell us who O'Brien is, I cried. Oakes became very serious. I believe O'Brien was the man watching on the balcony when Dr. Moore was assaulted. Also that he was the man at the bridge who warned you, Stone, of danger, but who has kept his identity hidden. We had strong proof that he was at the hut watching, as were we. He accidentally left a part of his shirt with my man, remember. I also believe that he was wounded and is in hiding, wounded by Maloney on the highway when he was about to close in upon him. What do you mean? Cried Moore. What curious conduct for a man to keep in hiding. No, not at all, answered Oakes sharply. Remember how you saw him on horseback one night, revolver in hand? Well, he was attending to business. O'Brien is working on the Mansion mysteries. I believe he only knows half of the affair. He does not realize Maloney may be the murderer of Mark. His conduct is in accord with that of a brave detective working single-handed and desiring to keep his identity secret. A detective? Yes, I fancy so, answered Oakes, with a smile on his face. Why not? We are not the only bees around the honeysuckle. By George, I never thought of that, exclaimed Moore. Indeed, retorted Oakes in dulcet tones. Why should you? You have not played this game before. It is new to you. And does Hallen know? Does he mistrust that O'Brien is a detective? Oakes laughed. Boys, you're slow. Of course he does. He has even found out there is a well-known detective by the name of Larkin, who is fond of the alias O'Brien. This Larkin has a scar under his hair in front. We will perhaps be able to identify O'Brien soon. What made you first mistrust? I asked. Why, remember how curiously O'Brien acted when we hunted the robe, how indifferent he was, how he used dialect. Yes, but why? How? Well, interrupted Oakes, that dialect was poor, unnatural, consequently perhaps assumed. That was the first clue to explain the curious actions of Maloney's loving friend, who has stuck to him like molasses to a fly's leg. Let us go into town and have dinner at the hotel, I cried, disgusted at my lack of perspicacity. My invitation was accepted with the usual alacrity of hungry men, and we soon were striding along, Hallen, Oakes, and Moore in front, and Dowd, Elliott, and myself behind. We walked close together, discussing the events and joking at one another in great good-natured animal spirits, for things were coming to a head now, and Broadway was not so far off after all. As the darkness closed in upon us, relieved only by the faint glimmering of the rising moon, we were in a compact body, an excellent target. Strong in the presence of each other, we had for a moment forgotten that we were in the land where a brain disordered was at liberty. We, the criminal hunters, were but human, and this was our error. End of chapter 20. Recording by Gertrude Durrett.
21 of Quintus Oakes, a detective story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Quintus Oakes, a detective story, by Charles Ross Jackson. Chapter 21, The Attack. We had advanced along River Road to its junction with the highway, and Martin had just closed in from behind as Dr. Moore started to say something about the dinner that was coming, when, just as we came into the shadows of the great trees to our left, a flame, instantaneous, reddish blue, streaked forth from the side of the road, and a deep muffled crashing sound came to our ears. Everyone recognized it instantly. It was not the high crack of a modern weapon such as we carried, but the unmistakable guttural of an old-style heavy revolver. An instant, and the voice of Oakes rang out, cool but intensely earnest, "To cover!" And we covered. Never before had 6 men melted from a close formation so rapidly, so silently, so earnestly. Dr. Moore, Elliot, and I reached the trees on the other side together, and lost our identity trying to find a place for our hunted bodies. We lay down in a heap behind a burned tree stump, and said "damn" together. Somewhere around us was the fiend of Mona, and somewhere were Oakes, Hallen, and Dowd, but not with us. We could swear to this, for we were in a class by ourselves, and we knew one another even in the darkness. We heard a sudden scuffle in the road, and saw a giant figure rush by us, throwing a silhouette on the roadway. It turned, faced about, and crouched as another figure darted from the woods across the road. Then the figure crouching made a spring, and the two swayed to and fro before us like giant phantoms, and then the figure separated and one started down the highway, followed by the other at breakneck speed. Then we heard the voice of Oakes from somewhere: "Halt, or I'll shoot!" The fugitives stopped, ducked, dashed towards us and by us into the woods, and after them came the report of Oakes' revolver. We knew it by the quick high-pitched note. And then Oakes himself. It was evident to us he had fired in the air, for we all saw the small flame point heavenward as his weapon was discharged. Neither fugitive slackened his speed, but both rushed across the plains east by northeast into the face of the moon as it rose off the plateau of Mona. "What is who?" gasped Moore. "The witch," I answered, as a polar chill chased up my spine. "Oh, the d!" soliloquized Elliot. "See, the second man limps. He must be O'Brien. He is chasing the first one," whispered the doctor as we gazed into the night. "And Oakes is cavorting after the bunch. I play him straight and place," spoke Elliot. "He is gaining." We watched Oakes, fleeter than ever, steadier, disappear in the distance as the moon entered a passing cloud bank and all became lonesome and dark. "Let's get on the plain," said Elliot, and we crawled as best we could out of the woods towards the place where the 3 were last seen by us. "Let's be in at the finish," I cried, and we started in the dim steely haze of the obscured moon to follow the chase. Darkness impenetrable came on, and suddenly a wild moan of anguish reached us, an awful convulsive cry of terror. It neared us, and was in our very neighborhood, in our midst, and away again. And with it came the rush of feet, heavy and tired, and soon the light tread of the pursuer, the athletic soft tread of Oakes. I shall never forget that cry of terror. It was as though the soul had left the body in anguish. It was a cry of fear greater than man seemed capable of uttering. From out of the darkness came the voice of Moore. "A maniac in terror!" Then the heavy tread was upon us again. A body darted past me, and the heavy revolver spoke again. I felt a stinging sensation in my arm, a numbness, a feeling of dread and of fear. Then I reeled and recovered, and looking around me, saw the figure dashing away like mad. The moon was uncovering again, and the fighting instinct of the brute was aroused within me. I knew I was wounded, but it was a trivial matter. I felt the surging of blood to my brain, the pumping of my heart, the warmth and glow of the body that comes when one rallies from fear or surprise, and the next instant I was off in pursuit. Always a good runner, I seemed endowed with the speed of the wind. Slowly I gained. The man before me ran rapidly but heavily. He was tired. He glanced around and moved his arms, and I realized that he was unarmed. His weapon had fallen. I shut my mouth and saved my breath, and loosened joints which had not been oiled since the days of long ago when I played on my college football team. Slowly I closed in. The capture was to be mine, the honor for Stone, yours truly, lawyer. I unreefed some more, and the ground went by under me like mad. I was dizzy with elation and courage and bull-hearted strength, and then, just as I came within talking distance of the fleeing terror, there was a report, and my right leg dragged, my stride weakened and tied itself into bowknots, and I dropped my revolver. I realized I was done for. We all know the symptoms. The starboard front pulley of my new Broadway suspenders had busted. The next instant the terror had turned and was upon me. I felt a crashing fist in my face and another in my neck, a swinging blow on my jaw, and a quick uppercut in my solar plexus. And as the moon had just again disappeared behind the cloud, I sank to the plain of Mona nearly unconscious, overpowered. I felt hands with the power of 10 men seize my wrists. I felt them being tied together with handkerchiefs. I felt a heavy weight on my stomach and realized that I was being used as a sofa. Then I started to call for help, to speak and to struggle, but the terror who had murdered and frightened and held up this part of the state soaked me again with both fists. I thought of home, and New York, and mint juleps, and of the $2 I spent to railroad it up to Mona, and realized that it was all cheap for all I was getting. Then I started in to die, and the fiend struck a match in my face, and I nearly did die, for it was that quiet, aristocratic Elliot. "You're the darndest ass I ever saw," said he as he got off. "Why didn't you tell who you were?" "Couldn't," I muttered. "I was thinking of—" I never finished that remark, for the next instant Elliot was borne down to the ground by the force of the impact of a great body. He rolled about with the unknown, and tore and twisted. I heard the deafening blows rain on his head, and was powerless to aid, for my hands were tied, and I was strangely weak. I was done for. "You fiend! I've got you! You will murder Stone along with the others, will you? You terror, you!" I recognized the voice as I heard the handcuffs click on Elliot, and realized it all. It was too much. "Hallen," I muttered. "Thank God! Soak him again!" And I heard the blows descend on Elliot's anatomy. Then I relented. "Spare him, Chief. It's Mr. Elliot." Hallen roared in surprise. "Then the murderer has gotten away, with Oakes after him. I beg pardon. Ha ha!" And the Chief roared again as he undid us and called for the others. Lanterns were now brought from the mansion, and a crowd of Oakes' men collected around us. I noticed that Moore and Hallen were looking at me curiously, and then Oakes stepped to my side from somewhere out of the darkness. "You're sick, old man," he said softly. Sick? And then I realized that things were strangely distant, that faces seemed far, far away, and that Moore's voice was miles off as he rushed to my side. "Wounded! Look at his arm!" he cried. "Yes," I murmured. "It was that last shot. I forgot it." I tried to raise the arm, and saw that a red-blue stream was running down and dripping from my hand upon the ground. I stepped forward to point to Hallen, and to tell about how he slugged Elliot, but as I moved I lurched forward, and a great strong arm closed about me, and a tender voice whispered, miles, miles away. It was Oakes' voice. "Here, Hallen, give us a hand," and I felt myself lifted tenderly and carried across the plateau. I was dimly conscious that Moore was working silently, rapidly, at my side, and that the strong, supple arm of Oakes was about me, and that Hallen was helping. A great wave of affection came over me for these tender, dear fellows, and I talked long and loud as Elliot wiped my face, and I told Moore that Elliot was a past master at slugging, and all the time the crowd grew. I heard the name of Mr. Clark shouted, and then my own, and then, as they bore me in at the mansion gate, I passed off into the distance and went into a deep, dark tunnel where all was quiet and still. And then I again heard Moore's voice saying, "He has fainted, Oakes. Get him to bed, or he will faint again." There was such gentle tenderness in the faces around me, such gentle, strong words, and such gentle, strong lifting of my body, that I sighed at the deliciousness of it all, the splendor, the beauty of my journey, and all for $2 railroad fare. I heard some curious statements about great bravery in dashing after the unknown and all that sort of thing, and I knew enough to realize that the crowd had things twisted. Oakes was speaking to me like a big brother, and Hallen had somehow quit all his bluster, and was quiet and grave, and Moore and Elliot seemed foolishly attentive. I appreciated their kindness, but did not quite understand, and their attentions amused me. I should have laughed outright, but things were becoming confused. Then I realized that they were worried. How peculiar it seemed! The angel of friendship was about me. I felt a strange peacefulness as I entered the great mansion. It seemed like a palace with golden walls, and the familiar voices of welcome warmed me. Then I heard a deep, thumping, rhythmic tremor as it was borne through the air, and I knew that the boat on the river was passing the mansion. I laughed long and loud at the peculiar words it was saying. I talked to it, commanded it to breathe more quietly, or it would disturb those asleep on the shore. Then I tried to explain to the judge that I was not a brave man, that it was all a mistake, that I had chased Elliot instead of the murderer, that the jury had failed to understand, and I laughed again. My merriment grew as I caught sight of Oakes' face. It was so nonsensical of him not to have perceived that the steamer was at the bottom of the whole mystery. I tried to explain. Then I shouted at their stupidity, and finally laughed angrily and in despair. I was in the grip of delirium. During the night they searched for the bullet and found it, and some time next day I awoke in my right mind. End of chapter 21. Recording by Todd.
22 of Quintus Oakes, a detective story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Quintus Oakes, a Detective Story by Charles Ross Jackson. Chapter 22. The Insane Route. During the next few days Elliot called frequently and apologetically. Although he had suffered considerably at the hands of Hallen, he appreciated how much attention he had given me on the plains of Mona, where was my Waterloo, and he kept me informed of the doings of our party in the search for the murderer. But it was several days before he brought me the information that both O'Brien and Maloney had been found. O'Brien in a farmhouse, nursing his leg. Maloney walking about town, cool and collected, apparently with nothing to conceal. I was told that he was not yet under arrest, but had been coaxed back to the mansion to give evidence against O'Brien, as he was led to believe. But why doesn't he suspect? He must realize that suspicion is against him. Well, Dr. Moore told me recently that the criminal, if insane as we surmise, may be oblivious during his lucid intervals of what he has been through during his periods of aberration. I see, I answered, remembering that such had been often recorded, and as his attacks of mania may be unwitnessed, he escapes detection because he carries but little ordinary evidence of these during the interval of quiescence. Before my companion could frame an answer there was a sudden commotion below, a hurrying of feet, and the quiet, commanding voice of Oakes heard now and then above all. We knew the time had at last arrived for the closing scene. We both felt that the hour had come when the final settlement was to take place. Next moment Oakes appeared. I had not seen him for many hours. He was changed, haggard, worn. His handsome face showed worry and loss of sleep, but his carriage and voice were as usual, vigorous, independent. Grasping my hand firmly and turning a pleased glance of recognition at Elliot, he said, "Come, Stone, you're strong enough." And next moment he had thrown a coat over my shoulders and was helping me down the stairs to the dining room. He seemed to me to have grown more serious, more quiet than was his wont, but his actions were, as ever, strong, quick, easy of execution, and I knew that it was the steadying of the mind and body for the final strain. Oakes's reputation was at stake, and he was fully cognizant that an error of judgment, a flaw in his reasonings, a mishap in the execution of his well-formulated plans, might readily result disastrously, not only to his reputation, but to the cause of justice. Then I stepped across the threshold of the dining room, and beheld a scene that will always linger in my mind. At the head of the table sat Hallen, and to his right was Dr. Moore, whose dress contrasted strangely with the chief's blue uniform and brass buttons. Across the table from Moore was Dowd, and here and there about the room were some of Oakes's men, and some of Hallen's as well, lounging, looking out of the windows carelessly, but comprehensively. As we entered, a deep guttural of welcome greeted me, and Oakes seated me by Moore's side, and Elliot went over and sat with Dowd. Then the detective took the chair at the foot of the table, near which was an empty one. It was evident at a glance that Oakes was to be the chief actor, while to Hallen had been given the chief position. There was a moment's silence, then Hallen turned to Dr. Moore. "Are you positive," he said, "that Maloney is insane? I see no evidence." "I am not positive as yet," was the reply. "Some signs indicate that he may be in the so-called interval between outbreaks of mental disease, but he is clever, as are almost all the insane, and he covers his condition well. Still, we can and will put him to the test. We will soon determine if we are dealing with the insane route that takes the reason prisoner." "But how can it be? He is not violent. I do not comprehend." Moore glanced at the chief. "Let Mr. Oakes explain. I should be too technical, I fear. He has an easier flow of words." Hallen looked surprised. "Well, how is it, Oakes? How can you suspect such a man? Nobody ever saw him violent. What reason have you?" Then Oakes turned. He was somewhat nettled, I thought, at Hallen's manner, but his voice did not betray him. His words came clearly, even curtly, but as he revealed his comprehensive knowledge of the matter in plain, everyday language, Hallen's manner changed wonderfully. Never before had he had such an opportunity to see the education of the man before him. Now it came as an overwhelming surprise. "A lunatic does not necessarily rave or carry the ordinary signs of rending passion," began Oakes, as he turned a quiet face of acknowledgment toward Dr. Moore. "The one who hears voices, real to him, but really arising in the diseased mechanism of his own brain, ordering him to be a martyr, a savior of his country, or to spend the millions he imagines he possesses, is usually melancholy, reserved, cautious, ever on the watch, deceptive, but doubtful sometimes as to his own brain workings. Likewise, the man who possesses the homicidal mania may be cautious and quiet, to the ordinary observer a normal citizen, but the aura of insanity is around him. He lives and moves and deceives, and hides from the outside world the words that come to him day or night, the words that arise not in the voice of a living man, but in his own diseased mind. The sufferer says nothing of the voices that tell him he is persecuted, that the world's hands are against him. By accident, in a moment of unwariness, he may reveal that he hears such voices, but it is an even chance that he will be laughed at, and the warning fall on ears that fail to understand. He is considered a crank. Then the unfortunate shrinks more into himself, becomes absolutely dominated by the ideas and commands generated in his own false mind. He may become violent by degrees, may scare and haunt the places where he believes himself abused, and all the while the voices tell him he is foolish, being put upon, and finally he becomes controlled by the delusion that he is being persecuted. Then, perhaps suddenly, comes the incentive, usually a command of false origin within his own brain, that makes the worm turn, that reveals to the world that he is a maniac, a killer. He hears the word kill, and his mind, no longer even suspicious of its own disease, as it was at first, becomes frenzied. He sometimes attacks openly, but usually does so secretively, with the cunning of the tiger, and kills and slaughters. Then he returns to his dreams, quiet, satisfied, spent." Oakes paused. "You understand, Hallen," he said. "I am no expert, but such cases have come to my notice. It is not easy for me to explain more fully." "Go on," was Hallen's answer. "Go on, sir. I am deeply interested. It amazes me." The Chief showed his words were those of genuine interest and surprise. "The insane man leads a dual life," continued Oakes, "perhaps for a long time. Such a man is not yet an inmate of an asylum. His case is unrecognized. He is a soul battling with madness until some awful tragedy occurs, like that at Mona, to reveal his greatest of all misfortunes, the loss of reason." We were all silent when Oakes finished speaking. Not a man there but now recognized and realized more fully what we had been fighting against. Then Hallen rose and looked at Oakes, then at all of us. "Boys," he said, "according to custom, being Chief of Police of Mona, I am to make the arrest. That I will do, but let me tell you right here, it is Mr. Oakes who will point out the culprit. I have been unable to get a clue, and I'm damned if I will take credit from a man like that." As he spoke he thumped the table with his ham-like fist. Hallen was not a clever man. He was about the average, perhaps a little above, but he was as honest as the day was long, a staunch, vigorous man, and we all admired him. "Sit down," commanded Oakes harshly. "Don't give us any more such nonsense." And the Chief sat down, while we all half smiled at the discomfiture of both. "Now, gentlemen," said Oakes, "let us keep our wits about us. First let me identify O'Brien, if possible, and let us study Maloney afterward. Remember, if O'Brien is not Larkin the detective, my case is not ready. If he is the man we suspect, then we must turn to Maloney regardless of any presence of insanity now, as he may be in the quiescent period, so called, and may succeed in baffling us. Having once excluded O'Brien from suspicion, we will be justified in action against Maloney. We must prove his knowledge of the heavy revolver, if possible. Then, if we succeed in forging that link to our chain, we will move quickly. Upon his arm should be the cross seen by the dying Mr. Mark." End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Quintus Oakes, a Detective Story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Quintus Oakes, a Detective Story by Charles Ross Jackson. Chapter 23. The Test. As Oakes ceased speaking there came a silence. Although we were many there was not a motion for a space of seconds, not a sound save the deep breathing of Hallen and of some of the others upon whom the duty of the hour was to fall. Men trained for such scenes, always alive to the possibilities, always alert for trickery or treachery, are yet but human, and subject to the tension that is felt even by the most courageous. Then, in obedience to a signal from Oakes, Martin appeared, escorting O'Brien, who was limping, into the room and to the chair facing Oakes. It soon became evident to us that Oakes's real identity was unknown to O'Brien. Even if the latter were the detective Larkin, he had failed to realize that Mr. Clark was anything but the agent for the property. "You are wounded, my man. They tell me it happened in the highway the other day, and that afterwards at night you chased Maloney on the plains of Mona after he had fired upon us. Tell us about it, O'Brien." Oakes's voice was calm and strong, but in it I fancied I detected a note of pity. O'Brien hesitated, stammered. How did you know when I was shot?" he exclaimed. "I told no one." Oakes smiled slightly. "Out with your story, O'Brien. Did you chase Maloney for revenge, or for revenge and business?" O'Brien straightened in the chair. "Who is this man Clark? How peculiar these questions are!" His look plainly said. "Why, for revenge, of course," he answered. "Let's see your wound," commanded Oakes. O'Brien bared his leg. The injury was now nearly healed, but was still enough to make the man limp. Then, as he bent down to readjust his trousers, Oakes, accidentally as it were, brushed against his forehead, throwing back the hair from O'Brien's brow. We all saw a long, white, glistening scar, now exposed to full view at the line of the heavy hair. The man before us was Larkin, the detective. Oakes, with marvelous tranquillity, apologized for the accident, and said, "Why should Maloney have shot you? What is behind it all? Speak." "I do not know." It was evident to us all that O'Brien was avoiding the issue. "I see," exclaimed Oakes. "As O'Brien, you know nothing. As Mr. Larkin, the detective, you know more than it suits you to tell." O'Brien was on his feet in an instant. Who dares say I am a detective, sir?" "Nonsense. Keep cool. The chief here has satisfied himself. Tell us, why should Maloney hate you?" O'Brien glanced around and fixed his gaze on Hallen. "I am Larkin. He hates me because I have been watching him. Maloney is the man responsible for the Mansion mysteries, I think," he said. "Indeed? What else?" queried Hallen suddenly. "I believe he may be the murderer of Mr. Mark." "What proofs have you?" asked Oakes, as we all leaned forward intently. "No proof as yet." "Exactly. But, Mr. Larkin, you deserve much credit," said Oakes, as he led O'Brien to a chair by Hallen's side. "Sit here," he continued. "I am going to have Maloney brought in now. He has always been a good gardener, a decent sort of fellow. I must hear his story before I give him up to the chief. It has been suggested that Maloney may be mentally unbalanced. You will excuse me, Mr. Larkin, if I use you as a foil to draw him out while Dr. Moore assists me." Then, by way of an explanation, Oakes, whose identity was still unknown to Larkin, went on: "You see, Chief Hallen wishes to be sure of some little points, and so do I. Perhaps Maloney will not resent my questioning. He should have no feelings against the agent of this property, whereas he might object to Hallen as an interlocutor." Oakes was now a trifle pale, I thought. There were furrows on his forehead. His manner was suave and deliberately slow. But little did I dream the true depth of the man, the masterly manner in which he was about to test the mental balance of Maloney. To one who was ignorant of the terrible events this story tells of, and the dire necessity of discovering once for all who was responsible for them, the effort of these keen scientific men to entrap a weakened brain would have seemed unfair and cruel. But for those who knew the story and knew of the murderous deeds done in Mona by some unfortunate with a cunning, diabolic, although probably unbalanced mind, there remained only one alternative: to uncover and catch the criminal at all hazards. Martin left the room, and returned escorting the suspect, who was dressed in his working clothes, his coat covering a grey jersey. His face was stolid, but not unprepossessing, his bearing quiet and reserved. His blue eyes shifted quickly. Then, as Oakes stood facing him, he respectfully saluted Mr. Clark. The detective met him cheerily. "Good morning, Maloney. I have asked you as a favor to come here and identify the man who shot at you the other day. O'Brien has reached the end of his rope now." As Oakes finished his sentence, Maloney's face changed hue, but he faced O'Brien, hesitatingly, as though somewhat at a loss. "There's the man. Yes, he shot me," he cried. Then again Oakes began to speak, and we all knew that he was purposely deceiving Maloney, playing with him, waiting for the moment when he would make the slip, when, if of diseased mind, he would fail to differentiate facts from fiction, when the false paths suggested to him would hopelessly entangle him. "The other night, Maloney, someone fired upon us on the road. We have well nigh proved O'Brien is the guilty one. You chased him across the plain. We owe our thanks to you, one and all of us. Had you not been so close behind him, he would have killed Mr. Stone here." Oakes motioned toward me as he spoke. I saw it all. He was twisting the facts, drawing Maloney into a false idea that he was unsuspected, that he was a hero. "Yes," I cried, seeing the point instantly. "I owe my life to you, old man. I thank you." A sudden flash of remembrance seemed to cross the suspect's face. Then his brow darkened. There was some error here. He was no hero. But what was it? Somehow things were wrong. But where? Dim recollection came to him, then a calmness curious to witness, but his eyes were shifting quickly, and the fingers of one hand were moving silently over one another, as though rolling a crumb of bread. The man was suspicious of something, but clever enough to be apparently calm, although not yet able to understand the flaw in the presentation of facts. Then, with a supreme effort, he seemed to rally to the occasion and cleverly evaded the issue. "I only did a little thing," he said. "You need not thank me." The voice was uncertain, the tone pathetic, groping. Oakes had befuddled the poor intellect. Maloney was at sea and sinking. "Maloney," said Oakes again. There was gentleness in the detective's voice. He knew the man before him was going down. "Maloney, when we were fired upon, you were watching the would-be murderer, this man O'Brien. You acted with the promptitude of lightning. O'Brien dropped the weapon he had with him. Did you see where it fell? It was a great army revolver, a .45 caliber weapon." Maloney started and straightened up. There, at least, was a familiar subject. He remembered that, even though his mind failed to remember the details of the assault. But Maloney knew there was some mistake. It was his weapon, not O'Brien's, that they were talking about. Suddenly, like a flash, came full remembrance, momentarily only, and he unguardedly blurted out, "There is only one in the county like it," then cunningly ceased speaking, as though he feared his tongue, but could not exactly reason why. There was a scarcely audible sigh of anxiety around the room. Oakes had proved Maloney's knowledge of the old revolver. Dr. Moore was gazing intently at the gardener's neck. The carotid arteries were pumping full and strong, down deep beneath the tissues, moving the ridges of his neck in rhythmic but very rapid undulations. The man was showing great excitement. "Maloney," said Oakes again, quickly returning to the attack, "before we were fired upon we fancied we heard a cry over the plain, a curious one like someone yelling an oath or an imperious command. Did you hear it?" "Yes," interpolated Moore. "We thought the words were 'Fire!' or 'Kill! Kill!'" We all realized what the clever men were doing, telling imaginary things, trying to draw from Maloney an acknowledgment of a delusion. They were sounding his mind, playing for his weak spot. The suspect looked surprised, bewildered, and suddenly fell into the trap. His weakened mind had been reached at its point of least resistance. As in nearly all insane individuals, it took but a proper mention of the predominant delusion to reveal that which might otherwise have gone undetected for a long period. "Yes," whispered Maloney, "I heard the command. It was 'Kill!' 'Murder!' I have heard it before. I'm glad you heard it then. That proves that I am right. I knew I was right. I can prove it. Surely it is not uncommon. Gentlemen, I have heard it before. I know, I believe it was meant for ha, ha, O'Brien, ha, ha, no, no, for me." More stepped toward the man, whose speech now came thick and fast and unintelligible. Hallen closed nearer. Maloney was shaking. His face was turning dark. His jugulars were bulging like whipcords down his neck, his eyes sparkling with the unmistakable light of insanity. He stooped. "There it is again! Kill! Kill!" he cried in thick, mumbling tones, and bending low. Then he straightened up suddenly and flung himself around, felling Hallen and Martin as though they were wooden men. He seized a chair and hurled it across the table at Elliott, who dodged successfully, allowing it to crash through the opposite window. Quick to see this means of escape, Maloney followed through the smashed panes, a raving, delirious maniac. The test, carried out with such consummate skill, had not only proved Maloney's knowledge of the revolver and that he was subject to delusions, but it had also precipitated an unexpected attack of insane excitement, an acute mania. And now Maloney was gone, escaped. As Hallen and Martin staggered to their feet, the Chief bellowed forth an order in a voice of deepest chagrin and alarm. "Catch him!" he cried. "If he escapes, the people will rise in fury." We all heard a sickening, wild yell of defiance from Maloney as he reached the ground, a deep, guttural, maniac cry that struck terror to my weakened nerves, and which froze our men for an instant in their tracks, like marble statues. Someone broke the awful spell. It was Oakes, crying out, "He is going for the pond and the bridge!" And next instant he and Hallen were out of the front door, the men following in a rushing, compact body. End of Chapter 23. Of Quintus Oakes, a detective story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Quintus Oakes, a detective story, by Charles Ross Jackson. Chapter 24. Across the bridge. As I staggered behind the pursuers, I saw the tall, erect figure of Quintus glide rapidly across the road and disappear down the decline. In the briefest space we were at the crest by the road, looking down upon the pond. I saw Moore and O'Brien by my side, the latter swearing like a trooper. "Who is that Mr. Clark, anyway? How did he know who I was? Since Hallen's men found me at the farmhouse, this man Clark, this agent, has had a lot to say." "He is a man by the name of Oakes," I said. O'Brien, or rather Larkin, looked at me a moment. "Quintus Oakes?" "The same." "The deuce you say! No disgrace to me, then. I understand things now. But I should have suspected." The murderer reached the bridge and, hesitating, stooped suddenly at its near side. He had evidently picked up something from under one of the logs that formed the span. He straightened up and, turning, suddenly fired at Oakes, who was rapidly approaching. The deep tones of a heavy revolver were unmistakable. Maloney had secured his murderous weapon when he stooped. He had had it in hiding under the log. He was armed now with a weapon of terrible possibilities. In another instant he was across and mounting the green, sunlit slope beyond. 100 feet behind was Quintus, untouched by the bullet that had been sent his way. A few steps and he reached the other side, but as he struck the ground, the bridge, frail thing that it was, loosened from its center support and went crashing into the pond, leaving Hallen, who was close behind Oakes, on the side of the bridge with the rest of us. Oakes was alone, pursuing the murderer up the slope of the hill on the other side of the water, facing us. We saw him turn, as the bridge fell, and look at us. Then he made a sweeping gesture toward the north and south, and turned again after the murderer, who was just halfway up the slope now, his body dotting the surface of the ground with a shadow at his side, a shadow of himself, company in the race for freedom. We all simultaneously interpreted the gestures made by Oakes, and Hallen dashed to the north end of the pond to skirt it, while Martin and Moore dashed for the southern end, leaving Elliott, Larkin, and myself standing where we commanded full view of what was coming. We were conscious of several other figures dashing by us, and we knew that his men were straining every nerve and muscle to reach Oakes in his dangerous position. It was a long run to skirt either end of the pond, and to swing around the opposite shore, and thence up the sloping sides to Quintus's aid. We three remaining behind were anxious beyond expression. I leaned heavily on Elliot, and really prevented him from joining in the chase, where he would have been useless, the others were so much fleeter of foot. "God, that man Oakes is alone with the murderer!" cried Larkin. "He is too good a man to lose his life in the fight that is coming. Look!" We saw Maloney halt and face about. Then came a slight flash, followed by the heavy report of the revolver in his hand. Quintus was running slowly up toward him, and was perhaps 100 feet away. At the report he staggered, and dropped upon the green, slippery sward. "He is wounded!" cried Elliot. I felt sick at heart and weak, and sat down, Larkin by my side. We too were powerless, being only convalescent. "An elegant shot! That Maloney is a crack one!" cried the detective. "Yes," said Elliot. "It was determined before that Mark's murderer was a good shot." Then came another report, and we saw that again the murderer had fired. Oakes remained quiet. His body showed sprawled on the hillside. "Damnation!" cried Elliot. "Is Oakes dead? He does not answer with his revolver." "No," cried Larkin. "I saw him move, and see, he is braced to prevent himself slipping down the hill. He knows he is a poor target, and is not anxious to move lest he slide into the pond. That grass is frosty and very slippery." Then came the delayed crack of Quintus's weapon, and Maloney sprang into the air as he ran. He now went slowly and painfully, lurching forward along the crest of the hill. "Slightly wounded, thank fate, but Oakes could have killed him had he wished," cried Larkin. We saw Quintus rise and follow Maloney, then drop to his chest again, as the latter wheeled and fired 3 shots rapidly at him in delirious excitement. Oakes remained quiet and huddled, and despite the fact that Maloney was now an excellent target, he did not fire. "Oakes is hit badly," exclaimed Elliot. Then the speaker did an unexpected thing. Seizing his revolver, he discharged the weapon again and again in the direction of Maloney. "A long shot," he muttered, "but I'll keep him guessing." We could see the bullets hit somewhere near the fugitive, for he seemed disconcerted and turned toward the northern end of the pond, to run in that direction. He was now outlined on the crest of the hill. We heard another shot ring out, a shot sharp, staccato as it was, and we then emitted a yell, for we knew by it that Oakes was alive. Maloney fired again, and then Elliot, by our side, tried 2 more long shots with his revolver. We heard Oakes's voice, clear and firm it came, wafted across the pond. "Don't shoot again! He has no more ammunition! I will get him!" And Elliot, in suppressed excitement, exclaimed, "He was drawing Maloney's fire all the time. He was not wounded." "Yes, he knew Maloney had the old 6-shooter, and he knows it is empty now." "That Oakes keeps everything in his mind," said Larkin. "He is a good one." Then we saw the figures of the runners skirting the northern end of the pond. Hallen was leading. He fired at Maloney, evidently not having understood Oakes's word, and again came that clear voice across the pond. "Don't fire, Hallen. Remember, he is a lunatic, and he can't get away now." We saw Oakes rush to close in on Maloney, but the latter met his attack, and the detective was borne to the ground heavily. "Shoot, Oakes, shoot!" I yelled, as did Hallen, but Quintus responded not. We saw that the fight was furious, but were unable at first to distinguish the figures as they remained on the ground. They were locked in one another's embrace in a deadly, awe-inspiring struggle. Then across one man's neck we saw a forearm. The cuff was shining in the sunlight, and Elliot cried out, "That is Oakes." The two rose to their feet, powerful black objects, and by the outline we recognized the tall figure of our friend as they swayed and surged, gradually slipping and sliding down the incline toward the deep waters of the pond below. "Oakes has got him!" cried Larkin. "Choking him! Look at them!" We saw the murderer's body arch sideways and backward, with Oakes's hands around his neck. As Maloney's body came down to the ground again, Larkin and Elliot by my side shouted in admiration at the power and skill displayed. Suddenly, like a flash, the maniac turned, twisted, and next moment encircled Oakes's body with both his arms, and rolled toward the water with him. "He is going to drown Oakes. See!" The words came in a hurried gasp from Elliot, who was throwing off his coat and his shoes in a movement quick as the thought that had come to him. "He's too good a man!" he cried, and with a sudden rush Elliot was at the water's edge and into the pond, swimming with strong overhand strokes, head low and sideways, toward the opposite shore. Larkin and I could scarcely believe our eyes. The man was apparently gifted with great powers, for he cut through the water steadily, surely, and with a rapidity that was amazing. Over opposite the fight was furious, always nearing the edge of the pond. Help for Oakes was no nearer than Hallen, who, we could see, was dashing around the northern end of the pond in a desperate race to save him. On the other end, moving like the wind but farther away from the fighting men, I distinguished young Martin leading several others in the race for life. And down beneath us, quarter way across the pond, was the solitary swimmer, lifting his shoulders well out of the water each time his stroke reached its limit, each moment advancing steadily, surely. I saw at a glance that Oakes was doomed. Elliot could not reach him, neither could Hallen. Larkin by my side supported me, for my head was reeling with weakness. Suddenly he shouted across the pond, "Fight him! Fight him! Oakes, strangle him!" I could see now that, somehow, Oakes's arm was around the maniac's neck, and that they were on their feet again. Neither had a weapon. They had long since been lost in the hand-to-hand fight. "Oakes can't do it. Why in the devil's name did he try to capture him alive? Why did he not shoot to kill instead of to wound simply?" cried my companion. Now Maloney was surging, dragging Oakes close to the water's edge, closer, ever closer. Suddenly Oakes weakened and half stepped, half retreated to the water's edge. Then as suddenly the two figures swayed up the hill a few feet again, and with a quick cat-like movement Oakes was free. It was his one supreme effort, a masterfully, wonderfully executed vigorous shove and sidestep. It was evident Maloney was dazed. Oakes's stranglehold had told at last. We heard a mighty shout from Hallen, and another from the swimmer now rapidly approaching the bank. Maloney faced Oakes a moment. His chest heaved once or twice as his breath returned. He crouched, then sidled into position for a spring and launched himself towards Oakes, who, pale as death, stood swaying, his arms by his side, apparently all but done for. Then we all witnessed that which thrilled us to the heart, the sudden, wonderful mastery of science, aided by strength, over sheer brute force. Maloney came toward Oakes in a fearful rush that was to take both together out into the pond to death. Instantly Oakes's swaying body tightened and steadied. I knew then, as did Larkin, that Oakes had been deceiving Maloney, that the detective was still master of himself. As the heavy body closed upon him, Oakes stepped suddenly forward. His left arm shot upward with a vicious, swinging motion, and as his fist reached the jaw, his body lurched forward and sideways, in a terrible muscular effort, carrying fearful impetus to the blow. Then instantly, as Maloney staggered, Oakes swung himself half around, and the right arm shot upward and across the mark, with fearful speed and certainty. The onrushing maniac was half stopped and twisted in his course. His head swung sideways and outward with the last impact upon the jaw. His legs failed to lift, and with a wobbling, shuddering tremor the body sank to the water's edge. The next instant Hallen came tumbling on to the murderer. I heard the click of handcuffs. I saw the white shirt and black trousers of Elliot squirm up the bank, and next moment the vigorous swimmer, the aristocratic, great-hearted clubman, caught Oakes in his arms as the detective lurched forward and fell, momentarily overcome by his last supreme effort. A great rousing cheer reverberated from bank to bank. We took it up and sent it back in lessened volume, but undiminished spirit. They now came back from the other side of the pond, by the way of the north end, the men assisting Oakes carefully up the incline to us, and bringing also Maloney. His eyes were bloodshot, his features squirming in horrible movements, and through it all he talked and talked. His brain was working with great rapidity. He was shouting, declaiming, laughing, and all the while his sentences were without significance, without lucidity. Oakes pointed to the maniac. "I regret extremely," he said, "that I was forced to wound him slightly. I could not let him escape with that weapon in his hand." An approving murmur rose from the men, but Oakes checked them, frowning his displeasure. Then he turned to Martin. "Look at his left arm, boys." Hallen and Martin ripped off the sleeve, and Dowd, after peering at the arm, excitedly exclaimed: "The Blue Cross! Quintus Oakes, you are right!" Yes, surely there on the left arm, just below the shoulder, was a cross done by some skilled tattooer's hand in days long past, a cross of indigo. Then in the road a team appeared from the Mansion, and Dowd jumped in and waved his hand as he started. "Where are you going?" cried Hallen. "To Mona, to get out an extra, to tell how Clark, Mr. Clark of the Mansion, has captured the murderer, aided by Hallen of Mona." As the team started, Dowd yelled back again: "And I am going to tell Mona that Clark is Quintus Oakes." Hallen waved his arms, while we all again cheered the name of our friend, as we bore him in triumph back to the Mansion. Chapter 25.
Of Quintus Oakes, a Detective Story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Quintus Oakes, a Detective Story, by Charles Ross Jackson. Chapter 25. The Man of the Hour. Soon we heard the tones of a bell from far away. 1, 2, 3. Then a pause. Then a few quick strokes, followed by a low single deep note. Hallen answered our looks of astonishment. "That's the old bell of headquarters. The mayor promised to ring it, day or night, when the mystery was solved, and Dowd has carried the news." Then again came the deep tones in quicker rhythm, and we knew it was all the old bell could do in the way of joy. We scarce had time to congratulate Oakes on the splendid termination of his work before Hallen was away with his men, taking Maloney to town by a roundabout way. Then came the crowd to besiege the Mansion and to call for Oakes and for Hallen, in fact for us all. The growling and discontent had vanished. The past uneasiness was gone. Oakes and Hallen were now the heroes of Mona. Oakes spoke a few words of thanks to the crowd and tried to dispose of it by saying that Hallen had returned to town with the prisoner, but it lingered long before the Mansion, discussing the successful termination of Mona's woes. Now that a master had unravelled the mystery, details were not difficult to supply. Many recalled, suddenly, that they had always thought Maloney queer, though they had never considered as significant the points that might have been vital. Such is always the case with untrained observers. We made our farewells that night, for we were to return to New York next day. But Quintus kept the hour of our going private, for, as he said to us, he had had too much of the kindness of Mona already, and there were whispers of an ovation or something of that sort reserved for our departure. "You know, Stone," Oakes said to me, "we don't really deserve all this good feeling. These people will never stop. I am going to slip out quietly tomorrow, and you and Dr. Moore can come later." "Nonsense," said I. "Stay and let them show their appreciation of what you have done. Why, old man, you have changed the course of events in Mona. You cannot help being in their minds." "You don't understand," said he. "I dislike heroics. Mona overestimates matters. I am going away unexpectedly." Here he set his jaws hard and looked determined, self-reliant, half disgusted. I knew that he was in earnest, and that his nature was calling once more for action, and not for praise. At 11 o'clock next morning Oakes walked over to the police headquarters, while Dr. Moore and I remained in the hotel, casually watching him. He was going to make a short call on Chief Hallen, as he had frequently done before, and it was to be his farewell. He had planned to have a horse at the proper moment, and to mount quickly and leave for the station alone, thus avoiding notice and any demonstration. Since we remained at the hotel, he hoped that the people would be misled into thinking that he would return to us, and that we would all go together. But for once Quintus Oakes was wrong. Mona was on the lookout for him, and he had no sooner gone into headquarters than some one started the rumor that the man was going away quietly. In a minute the place was the center of a seething, happy, expectant crowd. When Oakes finally appeared on the steps, instead of seeing his horse rounding the corner as he had planned, he beheld the crowd in waiting. He made a step back to enter the headquarters door, but Chief Hallen laughingly held him, and Quintus Oakes was cornered. Moore and I were now with the crowd, and joined in the laugh at his expense. A deep flush appeared on his face, but we all noticed a merry twinkle in his deep blue eyes nevertheless. Someone cried for a speech. Oakes hesitated and tried again to retreat, but at that moment all eyes were turned suddenly to a wagon coming down the side street and accompanied by a small crowd. It turned into the square, and a hush fell over all, for there in the vehicle was Maloney, the murderer, and an old gray-haired man, Skinner. The murderer of Mr. Mark was handcuffed and sat heavily guarded, but the old man was not a prisoner. His head was bowed in silent grief as he sat by Maloney's side. It was evident to all that the prisoner was being removed from headquarters to the courthouse for trial, and that the father was bearing his burden before the world. Quintus Oakes gave a glance of pity at the prisoner, and an extremely sorrowful expression crossed his strong handsome face as he recognized the old man by Maloney's side. The populace, recovering from its surprise at sight of the wagon, changed its mood, and surrounded it with angry demonstrations, hissing and threatening. The face of the prisoner was calm, proud, defiant, the face of a man in triumphal entry. He was unconscious of his awful position, his awful crimes. He saw only the notoriety. Dr. Moore turned to me. "See Maloney, see his face. He thinks himself a hero. He is too insane to appreciate the truth." But Skinner looked out upon the crowd and paled. Then glancing up, he caught the eyes of Quintus Oakes, and with a harrowing, beseeching expression, bent his gray head into his hands. The populace in fury tried to stop the wagon, but now at this instant Oakes rose to the occasion, and the man showed the mettle and humanity that was in him. Rising to his full height, he spoke. "Stop! This is no time to hiss. Remember, the murderer is irresponsible, the other is his father, an old, old man." As Quintus's voice rang out in its clear, strong tones, with a marvelous tender accent, and as the full meaning of his words became apparent, a sudden silence seized the crowd. A silence intense, uneasy, sympathetic. Quintus Oakes was single-handed, alone, but the mastermind, the controlling man among us all. The silence deepened as men glanced about them with ill-concealed emotion, deep, suppressed. The wagon moved on, and the stillness was broken only by the crunching of wheels and the occasional sighing, heavy breathing of the populace. Over all was the suspense, the quick, awe-inspiring change from vicious hatred to pity and grief, blended instantly in the hearts of all by that strong, vigorous, quick-minded man of action and of justice, Oakes. Taking advantage of the lull, Quintus stepped into the crowd, and before any could foresee his purpose, he threw his coat over the pommel of a saddled horse just being led around the corner, his horse, and springing lightly, gracefully to the saddle, took the reins. The crowd, divining his intent, closed about him, but with horsemanship beautiful to behold he forced the animal to canter to one side, and then to rear, making an opening in the crowd. The next moment he darted forward, away, as the people, realizing the tenderness of his speech, and that he was leaving them, perhaps for always, bellowed a reverberating, tumultuous farewell. Chief Hallen shouted a hurried command, and the next moment we were all electrified to hear the deep tones of the bell of headquarters ring out its ponderous God-speed. Oakes turned in his saddle at the first stroke, and with blazing eyes and suppressed pride, waved a last vigorous acknowledgment. Finis. End of chapter 25. Recording by Todd. End of Quintus Oakes, a detective story, by Charles Ross Jackson.